"You belong to me now," he said to the obese girl sold by her father, but his true plan was, "You belong to me now." Those were the first words Caleb Northwood said after handing 75 silver dollars to the drunken man across the tavern table. Violet Mae Thompson stood beside her father, trembling. The smell of whiskey and sweat hung heavy in the smoky air. Her father's voice slurred as he lifted the coins, laughing bitterly. "See that? The fat one finally worth something after all." The men at the table burst into laughter. Violet's cheeks burned crimson. She wanted to disappear. She'd spent her entire life being mocked for her weight, her quiet voice, her softness, but nothing could have prepared her for being sold. Caleb's jaw clenched, his gray eyes, cold, unreadable, fixed on her father. "We're done here," he said sharply. Then he turned to Violet. "Come with me." Violet hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't dare look at her father again. When Caleb guided her outside into the freezing night, she stumbled after him, clutching her torn shawl. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked toward his wagon. On the way up the mountain trail, he finally spoke again. "Violet, from this day on, you belong to me." The words struck her like a hammer. Tears blurred her vision. She turned her face away, thinking she'd traded one kind of prison for another. Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking. Caleb didn't reply. The rest of the journey was silence. Only the creak of the wagon wheels and the wind sighing through the pines. By the time they reached the cabin, Violet's tears had frozen on her cheeks. She braced herself for cruelty, but when Caleb opened the cabin door, the firelight glowed warm and steady, and his next words would change everything. The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, half buried in snow and silence. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a faint orange glow flickered through the frosted window. To Violet, it looked both safe and frightening, like a wolf's den with a fire inside. Caleb jumped down from the wagon and offered his hand. Violet hesitated before taking it. His palm was rough, warm, steady. He guided her inside without saying a word. The heat from the hearth hit her face, and she almost cried from relief. "Sit down," Caleb said quietly, removing his coat. Violet obeyed, sinking onto a wooden chair near the fire. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward the warmth. She had expected shouting, commands, maybe worse. Instead, Caleb moved around the cabin in calm, deliberate silence, adding logs to the fire, fetching a kettle, unwrapping a loaf of bread and a small wheel of cheese. When he finally spoke again, his tone was gentle. "Eat something. You haven't had a proper meal in a while, have you?" Violet looked up, startled. I'm fine," she murmured automatically, though her stomach growled in protest. Caleb gave a faint, knowing smile. "That's not true." He pushed the plate toward her. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The words hit her harder than she expected. Safe. It had been years since anyone said that to her. She took a small bite, then another, tears stinging her eyes. Caleb leaned against the wall, watching her quietly. His expression was unreadable. Not pity, not desire, just something steady. "When I said you belonged to me," he said finally, "I didn't mean you're mine to command." Violet froze, looking up. "I meant," he continued, his voice low but firm, "that you belong to this home now, to safety, to warmth. No one will sell you again, not while I'm breathing." Violet's lips parted, but no sound came. She couldn't understand why a man would buy her just to protect her. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. Caleb stared into the fire. "Because I've seen what happens when no one steps in. My sister was sold to a man worse than your father. I didn't reach her in time." His voice cracked slightly, barely perceptible. "She didn't survive the winter." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the logs. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can make sure no one else lives her story." Violet pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart thudded painfully. "You saved me," she whispered. Caleb shook his head. "No, I just gave you a place to start again." He turned away, adjusting the curtains, giving her space. "Your room is down the hall on the left. The bed's made, and there's a stove to keep you warm. Rest, Violet. You've been through enough for one lifetime." As she stood, the firelight caught her tear-streaked face. "Thank you," she said softly. Caleb didn't look back, but his voice was steady. "You don't owe me thanks. Just promise me this. You'll never let anyone make you feel worthless again." That night, as Violet lay beneath a quilt, smelling faintly of pine and smoke, she realized that for the first time in years she wasn't afraid to close her eyes. She didn't know it yet, but this mountain cabin would become the first home her heart ever recognized. The first few days passed in a blur of snow and silence. Violet woke each morning to the scent of burning pine and the faint crackle of firewood being chopped outside. Caleb was always up before sunrise, his shadow moving steadily across the frosted windows. When he came inside, his face was flushed from the cold, his hands rough and raw from work, yet his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Eat," he would say, setting a bowl of oatmeal or stew on the table before her. "Then rest a bit more. The storm's not letting up." Violet obeyed without argument. She had grown used to orders, but these were different. His commands didn't bruise. They carried warmth, not authority. Every meal he made was simple but full of care. Sometimes she caught him glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, as if making sure she was real and safe. By the third day, she gathered the courage to ask, "Can I help with something?" Caleb looked up from sharpening his axe. "You don't need to." "I want to," she said quietly. "I don't like just sitting here while you do everything." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Start with the herbs by the window. They need trimming." That was how it began. Small, simple tasks. She trimmed herbs, folded linens, dusted the shelves. Caleb never corrected her or raised his voice, not even when she burned the bread or dropped a plate. Instead, he only smiled faintly and said, "We'll do better next time." The rhythm of life on the mountain settled into something steady. Days filled with the sound of the wind brushing through pines. Nights with the gentle murmur of Caleb reading aloud from an old, worn book. He wasn't much of a talker, but when he did speak, his words had weight. "Why do you live up here all alone?" Violet asked one evening as they sat near the fire. Caleb stirred the flames with the poker. "Because quiet doesn't lie," he said after a pause. "People do. Down there, in the towns, everyone has a price. Up here, a man's worth is in the work he does and the promises he keeps." She nodded slowly. "And you? What promise are you keeping?" He looked at her, his gray eyes softening. "To protect what I can." The simplicity of that answer struck something deep in her. She didn't press further. But that night, as she lay in bed, she realized she no longer heard silence as emptiness. It sounded like peace. Weeks passed. Violet's laughter began to return, quiet and hesitant at first, then brighter each day. She found joy in small things. The way the snow glittered like silver dust at sunrise, the scent of stew simmering for hours, the soft whistle Caleb made while working. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry, a gust of wind lifted the sheet from her hands. She ran after it laughing until she tripped over a drift of snow. Caleb, hearing her laughter turn into a yelp, came rushing out, axe still in hand. "You all right?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She was laughing so hard she couldn't answer. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, her cheeks pink from the cold. For the first time, Caleb's lips curved into something more than a faint smile, a true, unguarded grin. "You're not afraid anymore," he said quietly. Violet looked up at him, the man who had once terrified her simply by existing. "No," she whispered, "I'm not." And as they sat there in the snow, the mountain around them glowing gold in the afternoon sun, she realized something astonishing. She didn't just feel safe. She felt seen. For the first time in her life, Violet May Thompson was not invisible. Winter clung to the mountains like a stubborn ghost. Snow fell almost every night, soft and endless, blanketing the world in quiet. But inside the cabin, warmth lived and breathed, in the fire that never went out, in the steam from Violet's cooking, and in the easy rhythm of two people learning to exist side by side. Each morning began with the same ritual, Caleb bringing in firewood, Violet brewing coffee, and frying biscuits in the cast-iron pan. At first, she only cooked because she felt she should repay him somehow, but soon she began to enjoy it. The way he'd pause whatever he was doing, lean against the doorframe, and watch her with quiet appreciation. "You make this place smell like home," he said once, catching her by surprise. She flushed. "It's just biscuits." He smiled faintly. "No, it's more than that." There was nothing romantic in his tone. Not yet. Only honesty. But for Violet, whose whole life had been made of ridicule and pity, those simple words felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. They worked together through long, cold days. Caleb taught her how to split kindling without hurting her hands, how to gather pine resin to start fires faster, how to patch a leaky roof with pitch and patience. When she failed, he didn't scold. He simply stood beside her, guiding her hands until she got it right. "You've got strength," he said one afternoon as she managed to lift a heavy log on her own. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Violet turned away so he wouldn't see her eyes glisten. "You're the first person who's ever said that to me," she murmured. "I'm just the first person who noticed," he replied. At night, they often sat by the fire. Caleb would read from an old Bible or a worn poetry book, his voice deep and slow. Violet would mend clothes, sometimes humming softly. Once, when she thought he wasn't paying attention, she sang just a few notes of a lullaby her mother used to hum. Caleb put the book down. "That's beautiful," he said. She stopped, embarrassed. "It's nothing, just a tune." "It's peace," he said simply. "Keep singing." So she did, and the cabin seemed to breathe along with her song, the logs popping, the fire crackling, the world outside holding its breath. Spring crept in slowly. The snow began to melt, revealing green under the white. Birds returned to the trees, and the river behind the cabin roared back to life. One morning, Violet stepped outside and gasped. The valley below was covered in wildflowers. "Never thought I'd live long enough to see that again," Caleb said, joining her on the porch. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," he said without hesitation. Violet froze. Caleb's voice hadn't changed. Calm, certain, sincere, but the words wrapped around her like warmth she didn't know she craved. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "Didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She shook her head, tears threatening to fall. "You didn't. It's just, no one's ever said that to me before." Caleb's eyes softened. Then they were blind. For a long moment they stood in silence, watching the wind move through the flowers. It wasn't a confession, not yet. Just a truth spoken aloud, fragile and real. That night, Violet baked a pie with the last of their dried apples. When she placed it on the table, Caleb stared at it as if it were the finest feast in the world. "What's this for?" he asked. "For being kind," she said. He took a bite, then another, his face lighting up. "Violet," he said, half teasing, "if you keep cooking like this, I might start thinking you're trying to keep me around forever." Her laugh was soft, genuine. "Maybe I am." Outside, spring thunder rumbled far off in the valley, but inside, the fire glowed steady. Two people who had once lived in fear and silence now shared warmth, laughter, and the first stirrings of love, not rushed, not demanded, but earned through patience and grace. It was the kind of love the mountain kept secret, tucked deep in its quiet heart. The peace didn't last forever. It never does. Not for people who fled something. By early summer, Violet and Caleb's life had settled into something almost dreamlike. The garden flourished. The air smelled of pine and rain. They laughed more than they spoke, and sometimes that was enough. But one morning, a sound shattered the calm, the distant clatter of horses' hooves on the stony trail. Caleb stiffened instantly. His hand went to the rifle hanging by the door. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Violet's heart dropped. "Who is it?" "Could be travelers," he said, though his tone said otherwise. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. Two riders emerged from the fog, one of them wearing a tattered hat she recognized even before her mind allowed her to believe it. Her father. "Caleb!" he bellowed, his voice as raw as gravel. "We've come for what's mine." Violet's stomach turned cold. Behind him rode a deputy from town, the sheriff's badge glinting in the weak morning light. Caleb descended the steps, shoulders squared. "You'll find nothing that belongs to you here." The older man spat onto the dirt. "That girl you stole, she's my daughter. You bought her fair, and now I'm taking her back." "She's not for sale," Caleb said evenly. Violet stepped out before she could stop herself. "Father, please." He turned, eyes burning with the cruel satisfaction she remembered all too well. "You think hiding up here makes you free, girl? I made you. I can unmake you just as easy." Caleb moved between them, his voice low and dangerous now. "You sold her, Thompson. You lost any claim you ever had." The deputy dismounted, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Now, let's not make this hard," he said. "Mr. Thompson has the law on his side. The marriage papers weren't filed legal. Until that's done, she's still under his guardianship." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's 22 years old. She doesn't need a guardian." "That's not how it works in this county," the deputy muttered. Violet felt something inside her snap. For years she had been quiet, obedient, ashamed. But not anymore, not here, not after everything she and Caleb had built. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I am not a child, and I am not his property. I choose to stay with Caleb, not because he owns me, but because he respects me." her father sneered. "Listen to her, preaching like she's someone. You think this brute cares about you? He just wants a warm body for the winter." Caleb's eyes darkened. "Careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The deputy looked between them, nervous. "Maybe we should all calm down." But Mr. Thompson reached for his pistol. In the same heartbeat, Caleb's rifle was raised, steady, silent, deadly. The standoff stretched tight as a bowstring. Then Violet did the only thing she could think of. She stepped between them. "No!" she cried. "No more violence, not because of me." Caleb's voice softened instantly. "Violet, step back." She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "You once told me I belonged to this home, to peace. If you kill him, that peace dies too." The moment hung frozen. Then Caleb slowly lowered his gun. The deputy exhaled, relief flooding his face. Mr. Thompson sneered again, but this time it sounded hollow. "You'll regret this," he spat, climbing back onto his horse. "I'll be back with papers, real ones." They rode off, their figures swallowed by fog. When the silence returned, Violet turned to Caleb. "He won't stop." "I know," Caleb said quietly, "but neither will I." He reached for her hand, calloused, warm, unwavering. "You're not alone anymore, Violet. Whatever comes next, we face it together." For the first time in her life, she believed those words. The mountain no longer felt like exile. It felt like defiance, like freedom wrapped in love. The storm came 3 weeks later, not one of snow or rain, but of fury and reckoning. The wind howled across the ridge that morning, carrying with it the faint echo of hooves. Caleb had been expecting it. He'd spent every day since the last visit reinforcing the cabin door, oiling his rifle, and preparing Violet for what might come. When the first shadow appeared between the trees, he said only one word: "Inside." Violet hesitated. "No, Caleb, not this time. I'm not hiding." He looked at her, the same girl who once trembled at every raised voice, now standing straight, calm, fierce. His heart swelled with pride and dread in equal measure. "All right," he said, "then you stay beside me." 5 men rode into the clearing, her father at the front, the deputy again, and 3 hired hands armed with pistols and rope. The old man's voice cut through the wind. "I told you I'd come back," he shouted. "The law says she's mine until a proper judge says otherwise." Caleb stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready. "There's no law that makes a man property, Thompson. Not in this country, not anymore." The deputy shifted uneasily in his saddle. "He's right," he said. "I checked the papers. She's of age. There's nothing binding here." Mr. Thompson's face twisted with rage. "You worthless coward! You'll regret crossing me." He turned to Caleb. "You think you're a hero? You took my daughter. You ruined me." Caleb's tone was calm, cold steel beneath the words. "You ruined yourself the day you sold her." The old man's hand went for his gun. But before he could draw, a shot cracked through the mountain air, loud and final. His weapon flew from his grip, spinning into the snow. Caleb hadn't fired. It was Violet. She stood behind him, rifle trembling in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. "Leave," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "Leave now. If you ever come near me again, I won't miss next time." Her father froze, eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, he saw not the timid girl he'd mocked and sold, but a woman forged by survival, standing tall beside the man who had taught her strength. The deputy dismounted and placed a firm hand on Thompson's shoulder. "It's over," he said. "You've lost." Without another word, they turned and rode away, swallowed by the forest and their own shame. When the last echo of hooves faded, Violet dropped the rifle. Caleb caught her before she fell. "It's over," he whispered. "You're free now." Tears slid down her cheeks. "No," she said softly, resting her head against his chest. "We're free." The storm passed, leaving the air clear and still, and in that quiet the mountain seemed to breathe again, proud witness to a love that had refused to bow to cruelty. The next morning dawned calm, the mountain washed clean by rain. Mist curled through the pines like ghostly ribbons, and sunlight spilled over the valley in gold and silver. Violet awoke to the sound of birds. Not fear, not footsteps. For the first time in her life, she didn't flinch at the silence. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. Caleb was already outside, mending the fence. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his movements steady and sure. She watched him through the window for a long while, her heart swelling with something too deep for words. When she stepped onto the porch, he turned and smiled, that quiet, patient smile that had saved her long before she ever realized it. "You should still be resting," he said. "I've rested long enough," she replied. "It's time I lived." He nodded toward the horizon. "Then live here, with me. No papers, no vows before men, just this mountain and what we build together." Violet's eyes filled with tears. "You mean stay?" Caleb reached out, brushing a loose curl from her cheek. "You belong nowhere but where you're loved, and if you'll have it, this is your home." For a long moment neither spoke, only the wind answered, gentle and warm. Violet looked out over the valley, her hand finding his. "Then I am home." They stood there as the morning stretched into day. Two souls once broken by the world, now whole in their quiet defiance. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. Outside, life began again. And though the world beyond the mountains might never understand their story, the mountain did. It kept their secret, safe and eternal. Sometimes love doesn't arrive wrapped in beauty or luck. It comes disguised as rescue, defiance, or a quiet promise whispered by firelight. Violet thought belonging meant being owned, until Caleb showed her it could mean being protected, being seen, being free. Wherever you're listening from tonight, a busy city, a lonely apartment, or a quiet mountain of your own, remember this. You deserve a love that keeps you safe without caging you, that sees your scars and calls them strength. Tell me, where in the world are you hearing their story from tonight?